Back in November 2015, Valve decided to release something new and bold upon the gaming community. In line with their previous endeavors, the Steam controller did away with the traditional joystick layout in favor of an owl-shaped peripheral. Interestingly enough, after a roughly year and a half or so of use, I couldn't find too many additional reviews that really put the controller's strong points and features to life until now. If you haven't noticed by now, the Steam controller isn't laid out like traditional controllers. In addition to being wireless and having some motion-sensing capabilities, it features the same left analog stick, shoulder buttons, triggers, and ABXY configuration, but there's something more than meets the eye. In addition to two under buttons that actually act as paddles, you do of course have the two touch pads on the face of the controller. The controller itself is powered by two traditional AA batteries, but can be powered by a USB cable just in case. It's a bit of a drawback that the controller itself doesn't have any rechargeable batteries, but battery power alone actually lasts a pretty long time, and I go for a couple months without actually needing to change the batteries at all. Furthermore, any quarrels of this about it not being rechargeable are pretty much quelled once I actually add new batteries into the controller. There's no recharge time or sitting around your console or, PC in that case, and you can actually just get right back to the gaming. Another note about the hardware is that the controller is utilized through the Steam Big Picture application. This will allow you to manage the controller's settings, but also its layout, which can be tailored to meet your liking. The responsiveness of the controller itself is actually super solid. I've never had any latency issues or any times the wireless controller function seems to just be not up to par with other controllers. Starting with the cons of the controller, the majority of the Steam controller's faults may be with the actual design itself. While the feel of the controller overall is very good, the shoulder buttons have a very heavy click feel that almost feels cheap sometimes when pressed. Understandably, it's not a AAA controller, but it can be a bit bothersome at times. Another quarrel I have is with the actual haptic pads themselves. Similar to the controller's shoulder buttons, they have a very firm and almost sometimes cheap feel. I could understand, however, that considering these buttons get a lot of touch and interaction, that some extra effort would be required in order to make a full press. If they were too loose, on the other hand, there'd be a lot of unintended button presses as a result of this, so I can completely get that. While we're still on the topic of the haptic pads, it must be addressed that these are a bit, weird. Those familiar with a normal joystick function will be disappointed they can't feel the natural movement and returning of a spring-loaded analog stick, but at the same time, PC players who have been using a mouse and keyboard might not feel that this is the mouse substitute they've always been waiting for. What you get instead is something, in the middle. And it seems to have a bit of a steep learning curve, but in most cases, this can be overcome by changing the settings and bringing some new ways to play some of your favorite games, but more about that in a minute. I think the absolute biggest complaint I have about the controller is the lack of support outside of Steam's Big Picture application. Sure, Big Picture is meant to bring the PC world to your couch, but this renders the controller completely useless when it comes to playing anything else outside of Steam. Say, example, if you were to use Uplay or Origin, you just couldn't do it. This is because the configurations for the controller load through Big Picture, and if you can't configure the controller outside of that, you're kind of stuck with the default settings. In that case, it's just a very basic joystick analog, and at the same time the right haptic pad just kind of defaults to mouse. It doesn't feel that very comfortable or intuitive at the same time, but you could get away with this using the default settings if you were playing some other game, depending on your feel. Luckily, I had a chance to play a lot of amazing games throughout the 2015 and 2016 year to really gauge how this controller weighs up. During that time, we had such staples as Rocket League, GTA 5, Doom, Hitman, Metal Gear Solid 5, and Fallout 4. All incredible titles that have their fair share of running, gunning, platforming, and driving to cover all the bases needed for a controller's usage. Like I mentioned before, the controller can be configured through Big Picture, and there are a ton of options here when creating your own macros, changing the styles of the haptic pads, and configuring your gyro settings respectively. Honestly, for most people these settings could be a little bit overwhelming at first, but luckily this is also supported by a community feature. Sure, you can make your own layouts and spend all the time in the world creating the controller to suit your needs, but Steam allows you to actually go and view other downloaded profiles, so that way you can actually try someone else's configuration and give it a whirl. As a PC player, I also have to say I'm absolutely in love with first-person shooters, but I can tell you that the Steam controller doesn't make a replacement for the traditional mouse and keyboard. Talking with other PC gamers, we can all conclude that nothing, and I mean absolutely nothing, can replace the keyboard and mouse setup that we've all come accustomed to. With that being said, the Steam controller has its perks in first-person shooter games. While aiming is a bit clunky, creating your own macros and taking stimpaks in Fallout 4 was a great plus. After some configuring, I was able to make tapping twice on the left haptic pad let me use the stimpak quickly to recover some health in a tight spot. This would be opposed to actually scrolling through the menus, choosing the stimpak, and then using it in-game where I could just create it as a macro and hit it very quickly. Another thing I want to bring up is the controller's gyro abilities. Enabling gyro for the controller helps alleviate some of the issues when fine-tuning your shots too. I prefer to enable when the left trigger is actually depressed, so that way you can tilt the controller left or right, up or down, and actually fine-tune where you're going to be shooting to hit your mark. Other games that are a bit more frantic, such as Doom for example, can be fun but overall overwhelming. The pace is just too much for using the Steam controller, and I often found it difficult to play, but again, that game is really best suited for a mouse and keyboard anyway. On the opposite end, the Steam controller works great for driving games and platformers alike. Having totally configurable controllers to play games like Speedrunners or Duck Game make it an absolute pleasure to transition away from your computer over to the TV for a few hours of couch time. The same can be also said for driving games. Let's be real, driving with the keyboard in GTA 5 can be incredibly clunky and not the most accurate, but the mouse and aiming on foot actually works really great. The Steam controller somehow mitigates both of these problems and rather well. The aiming can be compensated using the gyro function, and the driving can be handled effortlessly now that you have a controller in hand. This is where the controller absolutely shines and becomes the Swiss Army knife of gaming peripherals for your PC. Other third-person action games really benefit from the controller in the same way GTA 5 did as well. I played through the entirety of Metal Gear Solid 5 with the controller and took full advantage of the subtle movements that the controller offered in stealth situations, but it also kept its paces during some of the more demanding and intense aspects of the game. The new Hitman also is a good example of this. I'll be honest, it's a bit of a stretch for me personally to play Hitman on the keyboard because there's a ton of different little keys, but when using the controller, it just seems way more natural for these kinds of third-person titles. On a final note, I also want to add that I heard the controller works quite well for MOBAs and real-time strategy games, because you can configure the controller to not just be for analog sticks or joypads, but for actual button layouts. While I haven't dabbled with these too much, I can certainly see how this would work because of the controller's configurability. I know that a lot of these pros can be quelled with, well, just get a PS4 or Xbox controller, but in all honesty I don't want to. As a PC gamer, I like to be able to play with my food, so to speak, and the Steam controller offers that for me. It's always a ton of fun to hop from my desk and share and exchange it for a couch and big TV. Steam is also making constant firmware updates, so now that the groundwork is laid out in terms of hardware, I'm excited to see what future updates and iterations will bring. As of recently, we've seen a lot of updates including interface changes, firmware upgrades, and experimental haptic rumble features, but I'm excited to see what the future is going to bring. Would I recommend it for everyone? Probably not, but would I commend it for its contributions to gaming peripherals? Absolutely, and I can't wait to see more.
Oh, I missed that.
I stayed back and you just like tumbled slowly through the air.
Some Ethan Bradbury. Is there any capoeira fighting in when they went to Brazil?
No, they just pretty much ripped the safe out of that guy's walls and got Vince shot.